He could buy the whole restaurant. But on their first date, he chose to walk there and bring his mother along. When everyone else leaves the office at 6 p.m., Reid is usually just starting his third round of checking the numbers. The glass building by the highway, home to his fintech company, glows every evening as sunlight pours through the wide windows overlooking the parking lot. Luxury cars line up neatly, but Asher's silver coupe always stays in the same spot. He never drives it home. He never has. Asher prefers to walk, alone, along the old sidewalk by the highway, where the air is colder and the roar of trucks drowns out every thought. He tells his assistant he just needs some air. But no one has ever asked why he always walks at the end of the day, even though he could easily call a driver or drive himself. On the 6th floor, where only the executives have offices, Asher's desk has no family photos, no plants, no personal coffee mug. But inside his slim leather wallet, there's always one thing that never changes: an old, slightly yellowed photo of a woman smiling with her head tilted, holding a closed book in her hand. No one has ever seen that picture. Except him. Asher Reid, 35 years old, a self-made millionaire in fintech. Once featured on a 30 under 30 list, he's now quietly disappeared from the media radar. He hates the spotlight, hates networking events, charity galas, and especially the kind of calculated dating that happens on apps. Tinder's a trading floor, not a place to find a companion, he once blurted out during a meeting, leaving the entire room in stunned silence. His colleagues call him a golden mind wrapped in ice. Asher never argues. He doesn't need to make anyone feel comfortable. For the past 4 years, Asher has been the first to turn on the office lights and the last to shut down his computer. He still keeps his habit of sitting alone in that glass-walled room, his back to the door, eyes fixed on the ticker streaming across a screen almost the size of the wall. Impeccably dressed, light gray shirt, simple watch. He doesn't do small talk, doesn't do lunch with the team. But no one dares underestimate him. His success isn't loud, but it's steady enough to earn both respect and unease. Partners call him the man who never fails. Yet no one knows that every Monday morning, before stepping into the elevator, he always touches his wallet, just to make sure the photo is still there, as if to remind himself he's still anchored to something real. That's Asher Reid. Neat, cold, punctual to a frightening degree, and lonely in a way that no one believes is a choice. Some say Asher has it all, but anyone who's ever seen him walking alone down the boulevard at night, no AirPods, eyes fixed straight ahead as if running from his own thoughts, would know he's missing something money could never buy. Not everyone stays silent out of defense. Some people stay silent because they were never taught how to speak. Every time Asher steps out of the office, he remembers an old saying, "Slow down so you can see where you're going." It didn't come from a success guru, but from his mother, Reid, a former middle school literature teacher in the south of the city, where textbooks were more often torn than read. Asher grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment, where sleep was divided by unpaid bills and arguments echoing through the walls. His father was an elevator repairman who made a habit of cracking open a beer at 3 p.m. By the time Asher turned 11, the man was gone, run off with a woman from the laundromat. No goodbye, just a bag of clothes and an old pair of shoes left behind. Ruth didn't cry. She quietly cleaned the room, locked the empty safe, and went to school the next morning, wearing an old shirt pressed so neatly it looked new. At night, she graded papers, and when Asher lay facing the wall, she would softly read poetry, just enough to keep his sleep from breaking halfway through. When tuition went up, Asher threw his books on the table and said he was quitting school to work in a factory. His mother didn't yell. She simply sat down, opened his notebook filled with red marks, and said, "If you truly believe you belong in that factory, I won't stop you. But I believe you weren't born to be like everyone else." That sentence stayed with Asher into adulthood. It wasn't born from ambition, but from a quiet kind of faith. And he could never betray that faith. Asher got into college on a partial scholarship, working shifts at the library and the data center, saving every penny to get by. His startup dream began in a rented room with a broken heater and a pot of instant noodles that always boiled 3 minutes late. But just when he was about to pitch for his first round of funding, his mother collapsed in the bathroom. Cancer. Stage 2. But spreading fast. He packed up all his plans onto a single USB drive and locked it in a drawer. 3 months later, he sold his laptop to pay for a prescription the insurance wouldn't cover. 6 months later, his mother recovered. Her hair was gone, but her voice, when she read poetry, never once trembled. Asher never told anyone about it. People only knew he started his company 3 years later than most founders. No one ever asked why. Everyone was too busy counting what he had. When his first company was acquired for an 8-figure sum, the first thing he did was drive back to the old house where his mother still lived. He took her to an upscale neighborhood and picked out a villa with a backyard and a glass-walled reading room. Ruth looked around, sat down, and simply said, "I won't live here. I just want a place with a window that opens to a park, so I can see people walking their dogs in the morning." She moved into a small studio near the West Park, where birdsong outnumbered car horns. She grew plants on the balcony, adopted an old cat named Dylan, and kept writing poetry she never published. Asher didn't argue. He understood her better than anyone else who had ever passed through his life. Maybe because Ruth was the only person who had ever touched the part of him he didn't know how to name. Not with advice, but with unconditional presence. Every time he watched relationships come and go, he thought of his mother. He remembered how she never left, even when she had every reason to. How she chose to stay, not out of duty, but because she believed love wasn't something you had to win. Asher might not believe in many things, but he believed in the way his mother looked at him when she said he deserved to be fully understood by someone. And that's why, even after years of keeping his heart closed, he never truly locked that door. Because if there was ever someone in this world who could make him think about opening up again, that person would have to remind him of his mother. Not necessarily in the hair or the smile, but in the eyes. Eyes that wouldn't flinch when they saw the parts of him he never wanted anyone to see. Asher had always kept for himself a quiet, guarded space, a place where others could only stand outside and guess. But one afternoon, a single question made that silence tremble for the first time in years. And the one who asked it was Sienna Walsh. She lived on the 3rd floor of an old building near the train station, where the sound of passing trains sometimes slipped into her sleep at midnight. Her apartment was small, filled with books, sticky notes, a worn-out sofa, and a desk that always had at least 3 half-empty coffee cups. Sienna worked as a freelance communications writer, creating content for personal branding platforms and social projects. No uniforms, no fixed hours, no boss. But in exchange, she got a scrambled sleep schedule and deadlines breathing down her neck. She used to believe that freedom was the answer to everything. But after her last breakup, she realized that freedom wasn't quite the kind of healing she needed. She had spent 2 years with a man named Miles, polite, accomplished, and completely uninterested in introducing her to his mother. Sienna once thought that didn't matter. But everything changed the night she brought him home for dinner, and her mother made her signature beef stew. Miles stayed for exactly 3 minutes before excusing himself to take a call, and never came back. Her mother quietly cleared the table, packed the untouched food into a plastic container, and said gently, without a hint of blame, "Maybe he's just not used to sharing a meal with someone else." That night, Sienna realized that some distances don't need to be loud to break things apart. From that day on, she started paying attention to how people talked about their families, or more precisely, how they avoided the topic. She stopped believing in relationships that didn't value family, because if someone couldn't sit at the same table with your mother, how could they possibly walk beside you through the weary years ahead? A few months after the breakup, Sienna signed up for a content writing workshop at the local library. Not because she needed to learn more, but because she needed to escape the emptiness of her weekends. She brought her laptop, a water bottle, and no expectations. Reid walked into the workshop 10 minutes late. No laptop, no notebook. He sat in the back row, his eyes not exactly distant, but clearly uninterested in conversation. When the instructor asked everyone to write down something you once blamed yourself for, but now realize wasn't your fault, the room filled with the sound of typing. Only Asher sat still. Sienna couldn't help but notice him. After the break, she walked over and asked softly, no sarcasm, no pressure. "You didn't write because you couldn't think of anything, or because you didn't want to bring it up." Just one line, but it stayed with Asher the entire afternoon. She didn't ask what he did for a living, didn't pry about his job or the car he drove. She just asked that one question, then went back to her seat and kept taking notes, as if she expected nothing from his answer. When the workshop ended, Asher stood up, watched her packing her canvas backpack, and took a step forward, the first time he'd spoken to a stranger in months. "I think I owe you a coffee," he said, "and maybe a real answer." The coffee date happened 2 days after the workshop, on a Tuesday afternoon that was neither rainy nor sunny, just gray, like the walls of the small cafe tucked into a quiet corner of the street. Asher chose a seat by the window, while Sienna ordered a hot cappuccino with thick foam, the same way she'd been doing since college. No bright lights, no loud music, just the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain and the steady rhythm of breathing, clear enough to remind you where you are. Asher wasn't used to talking much, but he was surprised to find that he didn't want the conversation to end. Not because Sienna was trying to make things comfortable, but because she didn't ask any of the questions he'd grown used to. No. "So, what do you do?" No. "How many employees does your company have?" No. "You look like someone I've seen on LinkedIn." Instead, somewhere between talking about her afternoon coffee ritual and how her cat loved to step on the keyboard right before she hit send, she tilted her head and asked a question that made him fall silent for several seconds. "When do you feel most like yourself?" It wasn't the kind of forced, philosophical question people ask to sound deep. She asked it gently, as if talking about a freshly baked croissant, but her eyes were so sincere that Asher couldn't brush it off. He couldn't quite remember what he said. Maybe something about his evening walks, about sitting in the dark without turning on the lights, or about those moments standing outside his mother's studio door, listening to her read aloud from the other side. But he remembered exactly how he felt afterward, light and strangely hollow, as if he'd just opened an old drawer no one had touched in years. They talked for almost 2 hours. No interruptions, no checking phones, no glancing at the time. By the time they stood up, both realized the cafe had emptied out, and the sun outside the window had slipped behind the distant buildings. On the sidewalk, Sienna turned to him, her eyes bright with something both sweet and teasing. "Next time we meet," she said, "don't forget to introduce me to your mom, if she's around." The line passed like a gentle joke. Her voice was light, her smile easy, without a trace of mockery. Asher smiled too, but didn't answer, not because he was embarrassed, but because his heart had just slowed, just slightly, as if her words had brushed against something buried deep, something he hadn't yet named. She waved goodbye and walked toward the bus stop. He stood there for a few seconds before heading back to where his car was parked a block away. His hand rested on the door handle, but he didn't open it. The other hand slipped quietly into his pocket, touching the wallet inside. The photo was still there, still his mother, head tilted, smiling, holding that same closed book. Asher got into the driver's seat, started the engine, but didn't move. He stared straight through the windshield, his eyes unfocused on the traffic ahead. The line she'd said kept replaying in his mind, not because of the words themselves, but because of how she said them. Natural, effortless, as if it were something obvious, something everyone should do. Introduce your mother to someone who matters. That night, he went home earlier than usual. No lights, no laptop. He poured himself a glass of water and sat down, so still he could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator each time the compressor kicked in. That girl didn't know who he was. She didn't know his mother's name. She didn't know how much he owned, or how many people had come and gone from his life like connecting flights. Yet with one small joke, she made him feel that maybe he still had a reason to take someone a little further than a short coffee date. That night, he picked up his phone, scrolled to a chat with no saved name, and typed a simple message. "Are you free this Friday night?" No emoji, no opener, no explanation. Just a man testing whether he still had the courage to start something, without hiding behind work or a schedule. And for the first time in years, he found himself actually looking forward to something. Not because it was important, but because it was real. The message Asher sent was confirmed by a single reply. "Okay, see you at 7. No questions about where or what, no requests for details. But that was enough. He knew she would show up. And he'd already made a decision he wasn't even sure he had the courage to follow through with. The restaurant sat by the lake, not far from the city center, but far enough for people to forget about time. No crystal chandeliers, no multi-page menus, just the soft glow of amber light and the scent of aged wood in the air. It was the place his mother used to visit every autumn when the leaves turned and the water lay still like glass. Sienna arrived 5 minutes early. She wore a moss-green long-sleeve dress, her hair tied low, no heavy makeup, just a touch of color on her lips to keep from looking too pale. She didn't order anything yet. She simply sat at the window table he had reserved, fingers tracing the strap of her bag as she looked out at the lake shimmering under the lights. She had prepared herself for a simple evening: dinner, conversation, then home. No expectations, no hopes, no letting herself drift too far. At exactly 7 o'clock, the restaurant door opened. Sienna turned instinctively and froze. Asher walked in as composed as ever, dark shirt, steady eyes, the same quiet gravity she remembered. But beside him was an older woman, her silver hair neatly tied back, her hand resting lightly on his arm for balance. Her steps were slow, yet her gaze was clear, calm, as if she already knew how the night would unfold. Asher stopped at the table. His voice was low but steady. "Sienna, this is my mother. I remembered what you said last time, and I thought, if there's anyone who should meet you first, it's her." Sienna straightened a little in her seat, her hands tightening gently together beneath the table. Not out of fear, but because her heart suddenly clenched, not painfully, just in that old, familiar way it used to when she once brought someone home to meet her mother, and ended up sitting alone at the dinner table. Reid looked at her, a soft smile forming on her lips, one that wasn't merely polite. "So you're the one who made my son leave the office while it was still daylight. I had to step out onto the balcony twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it." Sienna let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't entirely relaxed, but neither was it forced. She stood, extended her hand, and said, "It's really nice to meet you, Mrs. Reid. Truly." Asher pulled out a chair for his mother first, then for Sienna. The three of them settled into their seats as if it had all been planned. Nothing awkward, nothing out of place. The waiter approached, paused for a brief second at the unexpected trio, then quickly fetched an extra menu. The air at the table wasn't lively, but it wasn't tense either. It felt as if each of them was quietly adjusting their heartbeat to match a new kind of silence. Not exactly uncomfortable, but the kind you meet when standing before a door, unsure whether to knock with your hand or with your faith. Sienna didn't blame Asher for not warning her. In fact, she felt grateful. Because somehow, a passing joke, "Next time, don't forget to introduce me to your mom," had become something real. He had taken it seriously enough to bring the most important woman in his life to their first dinner together. It wasn't a clever move. It wasn't strategy. It was courage, and a kind of sincerity she hadn't seen in a long time. Ruth didn't speak much, but every time she did, Sienna felt as if she were hearing a short poem, one that only revealed its meaning on the third read. Ruth didn't pry, didn't ask polite questions, didn't make Sienna feel small or tested. On the contrary, there was something about her that made Sienna feel seen, fully, beyond the clothes she wore or the words she chose. Asher remained as composed as ever, yet his eyes, each time they turned toward his mother, or briefly toward Sienna, held something different, not cold, not distant, but watchful, tender in a way that felt like someone witnessing the first sprout of green after a long gray winter. Dinner began with a simple salad and a plate of garlic bread. No one rushed to order the main course. The conversation moved slowly, but within that slowness, everything felt real. No one was performing. No one was trying to make the others comfortable. They were simply there, present, and in the right moment. And that's when Sienna realized, some dates don't need candlelight, flowers, expensive wine, or background music. All they need is a man willing to bring his mother along, and a woman brave enough to stay. The garlic bread had just been cleared away, and the light inside the restaurant seemed to soften as the street lamps outside began to shimmer across the lake. No one noticed how long they'd been sitting there. No one cared to count anymore. The air among the three of them was no longer the tentative quiet from the start. It had shifted into something closer to respect and acceptance. Ruth leaned slightly forward to take her napkin, then asked the waiter gently about the steamed fish. After choosing her dish, she turned to Sienna. Her gaze was still bright, but this time it carried no hint of scrutiny, only understanding. "Do you believe," she asked softly, "in the kind of silence that still feels full?" The question came out of nowhere, no setup, no warning. Yet it didn't feel intrusive. Sienna paused, momentarily caught off guard, then lifted her head to meet Ruth's eyes. "I think there are silences that make people pull away," Sienna said slowly. "But there's also the kind that keeps you still, because you're afraid of losing something if you move the wrong way." Ruth nodded. "Good. Some people think talking a lot means understanding. But sometimes, what we really need is someone who can stay beside us long enough without breaking that silence. Asher didn't interrupt. He took a quiet sip of water, used to the way his mother tested people with questions that hovered somewhere between curiosity and reflection. But this time, he glanced toward Sienna, not to rescue her, but to make sure she was okay. Sienna smiled, not smugly, not defensively, just the kind of smile that said she understood she just stepped a little deeper into the private world of a family that had long lived behind quiet walls. "My mom's not as calm as you," she began, her tone softening. "She nags. A lot. Honey butter toast, that's what she makes every time I skip breakfast, like sugar and butter could fix everything. There was a time I found it annoying, but lately, whenever it rains, I start missing that smell again." Ruth rested her hand lightly on the rim of her glass, tilting her head slightly. "Women don't really try to forgive with words," she said. "We just bake another loaf or pour another cup of tea. Everything else depends on whether the person across from us understands." Asher looked at his mother, then at Sienna. He took a slow breath, as if bracing himself to share something he'd always kept sealed. "I once had a funding meeting," he began. "My first one, after finishing the prototype. They booked the flights, the 5-star hotel, the full list of investors. That was the moment I thought I was about to change my life." He paused, eyes fixed on his glass, as though replaying the scene frame by frame. "But that morning, my mom collapsed in the bathroom. No broken bones, but her knee was swollen, and her eyes went distant, like she didn't recognize me for the first few minutes. I called an ambulance. They said it wasn't life-threatening, but she'd need someone watching her around the clock for a few days." Sienna looked at him, unblinking. "I canceled the flight," Asher continued quietly. "Turned off my phone, shut down my computer, stayed home for 3 days, then a week. By the time I went back, they'd already signed with someone else." He lifted his head. His eyes were calm, but his voice carried a weight that softened into the air. "I don't regret it. When a woman has once been your home, you don't leave her standing alone at the last station." It wasn't a line meant to impress. It sounded more like a confession, not seeking pity, not defense, just truth, simple and unadorned. Ruth smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming like the reflection in her glass of white wine. "So you finally told someone," she said. Asher shrugged. "Didn't think anyone needed to hear it." Sienna didn't speak for a few seconds. Her gaze slowly dropped to her hands resting in her lap. She clasped her fingers gently together, as if holding onto something fragile and precious. "I used to think people who love their mothers deeply might not know how to love anyone else," Sienna said softly, "because they're used to a kind of love that asks for nothing in return. But now I think, maybe they're the ones who never love carelessly." No one answered, but they didn't need to. Some words are meant to drift into the quiet, to linger there until they find their place in the heart of whoever's listening. Dinner went on. Ruth's steamed fish arrived, its gentle aroma filling the space. Asher ordered steak, Sienna, pan-seared chicken. The faint clinking of forks and knives mixed with soft laughter and the quiet chime of glasses touching, like an unspoken melody, delicate and steady. Yet every note carried weight, warmth, and something neither of them had felt in a very long time. And just like that, from a dinner that seemed so unconventional, something began to take root, slowly. Quietly, not dazzling, not loud, but real enough that no one had to say it aloud to know they were stepping into a place of feeling from which there would be no return. When dinner ended, the three of them stood up at the same time. No cue, no signal, just an odd, effortless harmony. Outside, the air had cooled. The lake had turned dark, glimmering like glass brushed by the glow of passing streetlights. The waiter bowed them out, and Ruth slowly fastened the top button of her coat, moving with the kind of calm that comes from not wanting to leave a place that felt unexpectedly comforting. Sienna reached out, gently touching Ruth's hand, her voice quieter than the wind. "You make me want to call my mom tonight." Ruth didn't answer right away. She met Sienna's eyes, long enough for her smile to stay genuine, not polite, then said softly, almost like a breath, "Don't call. Go see her. Some warmth can't travel through a signal." Sienna stood still for a moment, then nodded. For the first time in months, she felt something shift inside her. Not quite emotion, not quite regret. It was as if a small piece of herself stuck somewhere for far too long had finally found its way free, without anyone needing to touch it. Asher called an Uber for Sienna. He could have driven her home himself, but he didn't offer. Not out of distance, but because he knew that sometimes people need a quiet stretch of road to hold on to what still lingers, instead of rushing on too quickly. Sienna understood. She smiled as she stepped into the car. No wave, no goodbye. Just one long look before the door closed. Asher drove his mother back to her apartment. They didn't talk much. An old jazz tune played softly on the radio, filling the car with the kind of silence they both knew well. But when they pulled into the small parking lot in front of her building, Ruth didn't open the door right away. She stayed still, eyes fixed ahead, and then asked, as if the thought had just arrived, "Have you ever told any woman about Rose?" Asher didn't turn toward her. His hand rested on the steering wheel, not gripping, but not relaxed either. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like it had wandered back into memory. "No." Ruth nodded slowly, as if she had already known what his answer would be. Another silence stretched between them. Then she leaned back in her seat, her gaze drifting toward the lake, where only a few scattered lights from the old restaurant still shimmered faintly on the water's surface. "Rose is a part of you," she said quietly. "But for me, I've never had the courage to speak her name again." Asher still didn't turn his head. But this time he listened, completely deeply, so still he could feel every small tremor in his mother's voice. "That winter," she continued, "I was in a hurry. It started raining all of a sudden. The roads were slick. I'd promised to pick you both up after tutoring, but I was late. Rose decided to walk home with a friend. When I turned onto that street again, all I saw were flashing lights, and a truck stopped dead in the crosswalk." Asher closed his eyes. The feeling had never faded. "They called it an accident," Ruth whispered. "But I never forgave myself. I kept thinking, if I'd been on time, if I hadn't stopped to buy a new umbrella." Her voice caught for a moment, then steadied again, with the quiet discipline of someone who'd learned to fold her grief neatly into each breath. "Do you still remember her?" Asher nodded faintly. "She liked drawing windows," he said. "No people, no scenery, just windows." "She used to say," Asher murmured, "a window is where you can see everything, without having to step outside." Ruth exhaled softly. "Maybe that's why you grew up living the same way." Asher turned to look at her. There was no anger there, no blame. Just a quiet recognition, something deep and familiar, echoing from an old corner of himself he rarely visited. He hadn't expected Rose's name to surface tonight, even less that his mother would be the one to bring it up. "You don't let people get close," Ruth said gently. "Not because you're afraid of being hurt, but because you're afraid that if someone comes too near, they'll see the space you've been saving for Rose." Asher didn't speak, but his heartbeat shifted, slower, then faster. He thought of Sienna, of the way she had listened to him talk about the canceled funding meeting, of the way she hadn't rushed to fill the silence, but had allowed it to exist, as something real, something his own. And in that moment, he understood. Tonight might be the first time he'd truly let someone draw close, not through words, but through a silence that at last felt safe. Ruth opened the car door, her hand resting lightly on Asher's shoulder before she stepped out. No words were needed. Just that small touch, enough to close a wound that had gone unnamed for far too long. Asher stayed in the car for a while, watching his mother's silhouette move slowly toward the building. In the distance, he pictured a window glowing with warm light. Not Rose's this time, his own. For the first time, it wasn't a window to look out from, but one that let the light in. Sienna had just dropped her bag onto the couch, her shoes still on, when her hand instinctively reached for her phone. No messages. No notifications. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need for someone else to reach out first. She opened her contacts, tapped on a familiar name, and called. On the other end, her mother's voice came through, slightly hoarse from the late hour, but not irritated in the slightest. "You're home?" Sienna closed her eyes for a moment, and for an instant she felt 16 again. "Are you free tomorrow, Mom? I want to come by. No reason, really. I just miss the smell of honey toast." There was a brief silence. Then the sound of her mother's soft laughter filled the line. "There's probably still some honey left," her mother chuckled, "but not enough butter. Bring some, okay?" The next morning, Asher stood in his office as soft sunlight streamed through the glass wall. On the shelf, between neatly stacked folders, sat an old photo of two curly-haired children by a window. One of them was gone, but the frame remained, like a piece of memory he'd never had the heart to put away. He picked up his phone and typed a quick message. "I never thought one dinner could change 20 years of waiting." He sent it without expecting a reply. It wasn't meant to start a conversation, just something that needed to be said. A week later, the doorbell to Sienna's small apartment rang at 6:45 p.m. She opened the door, still wearing an apron faintly scented with tomato sauce. Standing there was Asher, holding a small box, and Ruth, in a pale gray sweater, her hands wrapped around a bouquet of wildflowers. "I made spaghetti and meatballs," Sienna said, a little shyly. "Nothing fancy." Ruth smiled gently. "As long as someone cooks for you," she said, "every meal is special." The three of them sat down and dinner began, without ceremony, without preamble. In that small kitchen, surrounded by the scent of sautéed garlic and the soft clinking of spoons against plates, no one said a word about love. But all of them knew something had begun. Something that didn't need a name, only a warmth that stayed. Because sometimes a closed heart doesn't need someone to break down the door. It only needs someone brave enough to knock and wait. Maybe at some point in life, we all meet someone who teaches us how to open our hearts again. Not with promises, but with a presence gentle enough to make us stop fearing the pain. Sometimes, love doesn't begin with a touch, but with a moment when someone chooses to stay through our silence. And what about you? How long has it been since you last dared to open your heart, even just a little, to let the light in? If you saw yourself in this story, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next emotional journey. Thank you for listening until the very end, where the smallest things often touch the deepest places.